Hi, my name is Mickey Richardson, and I'm here to address, to some extent, what kind of future major and minor prophets envisioned for Israel. Uh, I'm not really sure what kind of future they envisioned because of the way that I define the term prophet. Uh, Modern days, we think of a prophet as someone who's kind of like a soothsayer, someone who tells us our future, a Christian forecaster or prognosticator. And to me, the Old Testament prophets are not under that definition. When we use the term prophet in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, either one, they are not people who were able to divine the future. And I wanted to make that very clear, that they were not talking about future events when they were writing. They were reacting to the cultural things and the calamities that were going on right in front of them. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but I wanted to kind of make that differentiation. For instance, in the New Testament, when we talk about the spirit of prophecy, that someone has the gift of prophecy, the spiritual gift, we're not talking about someone who can tell our future through Christian communiques with the divine. That actually is quite pagan. If you go back to the origins of the crystal ball and being able to divine someone's future through any alternative means. A Christian modern day prophet is someone who reacts to cultural events much the same way that they did in the Old Testament. And so I wanted to give kind of my views on that before I went into what I think the minor and major prophets envisioned for the future of Israel. And so know that when they envisioned things for the future of Israel, they were not doing it with any kind of mystical powers, that it wasn't a and I don't want to use the correct word, that it wasn't something that they weren't soothsayers. They weren't divining a future. What they were doing is providing hope and providing assurance. And so we'll look at that and see. And we're going to start with our first prophet that I want to look at is Jeremiah. And specifically, I want to go straight to Jeremiah 32, 6 through 15. And in these verses, Jeremiah is going out and he's purchasing a plot of land. And he is excited, and he comes back and he shows the deed to this plot of land. And the reason that he did that is to show hope in God's restoration of Israel. Because even as he did that, he could look up and see the armies of Babylon descending upon Jerusalem. And his concern was not so much of, what is our future. He could see the future was looking pretty bleak, especially the immediate future. And that's what prophets deal with. The immediate future looked really bad. But in purchasing the land, he was saying, hey, God is bringing about punishment, but God is also going to bring about our restoration. And if I had to say that there is an overarching theme to all of the major and minor prophets, it would be punishment and restoration, predominantly restoration, because that would have been what they saw in their future. These prophets didn't know how God was going to restore Israel. They didn't know how long it was going to take God to restore Israel. They saw devastation coming, but their hope was that they were not going to be completely annihilated, that somewhere there would be the remains of the Israelite nation. And that is reiterated in the next one I want to look at is Isaiah of Jerusalem, which is the first Isaiah, and I want to look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. And in that, also chapter 6, 13, verses 13. And in that, he speaks of Israel being a tree, and the tree's getting cut down. Like Jeremiah, he can look out and he can see devastation coming. The tree's going to get cut down, but he says that's okay, because the base of the tree, the trunk, the stump, is actually where the heart, where the seed, the impetus, the creation, the primal instinct of the Israelite nation is in the stump, the tree, what is left, what is remaining. So, in First Isaiah reiterates that God's restorative powers do exist and will carry Israel through in the midst of the land being made desolate. It's hard for us sometimes to imagine that God's grace is at work in us when we are going through trials. Is God with us through trials? I think essentially what these prophets were doing is praising God in the storm, as a popular turn of phrase that we sometimes use today in the modern church, that, I will praise, I think there's a popular Christian song about, I will praise you in this storm, and that's what they were doing, because their hope for the future was not in the details, but it was in the generalization that God is in control, and He's going to take care of things, even though things are pretty bad right now. Notice that when I spoke of Isaiah, I spoke of Isaiah of Jerusalem, which is the first Isaiah. And I know that's kind of a sticking point for some people. Some people see Isaiah as written by one author, the book. Some people find up to 3. I'm probably closer to finding up to 3, simply because of the various monarchs that are listed and the times when they ruled, and that can be historically correlated. And so we know that there was, at least in my opinion, at least 2 Isaiahs that contributed to the book that we know now in the Old Testament. But believing that is one is all right as well. Ezekiel, we'll move on to him. He saw a vision of dry bones while still in exile. And in that vision, he saw Israel's restoration, and that restoration came from God. We need to remember here that Ezekiel was writing towards the end of the exile period. And so he could see changes in his culture. He could see things that were happening. He could see that things were, that the government was beginning to work in his, or the Israelites' favor, to have some kind of restoration, to return to that homeland. And so that's where he gets his vision of, we're going to be okay. We're going to be put back together, even though we are destroyed utterly. If you can imagine, and I love the prophetic visions that are given. They are so full of, chock full of symbolism and various aspects. But if you can imagine a body as a nation being put back together, and when he talks about the sinews and the flesh and the things, it's not just, he's saying that it's not just going to be the nation, the people, the bones that are going to be brought back together, but it's going to be the culture that's going to be revived. It's going to be the religious practices. It's going to be the language, because all of that is the sinews and the flesh and the things that fill out life, that are over and above and beyond the bones, the bare bones of life. I'm going to move back to the book of Isaiah, and we're going to look at 2nd Isaiah. And this is the writer who wrote chapters 40 through 66. He continues in chapters 40, verses 21 through 23, by insisting that while both the punishment comes from God, so does the restoration. And that is what their future is hinged on. Their future is not hinged on any kind of, event. It's not hinged on any kind of happy ever after, but it's hinged on God completely in His restoration, His time, His works, and that His will be accomplished. Going back to Ezekiel, something that I wanted to bring out that I hadn't realized earlier, and if you want to know what I'm looking at, this is called if I can get it up here. It's a discipleship book, and it's a class that I took several years ago, about 5 years ago, and I've hung on to the book. It is offered through, was offered through the United Methodist Church. It's called Becoming Disciples Through Bible Study, and this was a 34-week Bible study that we did through my church that I was attending about 5 years ago. And so I wanted to bring out, this is on page 90 of that text, and it says, "We cannot understand God's punishment and restoration. It is a great mystery. But Ezekiel did learn something important about the God of Israel in one of his holy visions." And I bring this out because I didn't realize it at the time that I was reading it, because I think it plays importance into this concept of what they saw in the future and in their restoration. It continues to say, "One day Ezekiel was sitting beside the river Chebar," I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, in Babylon. He had been one of those strong, intelligent young men roped into the chariots of Nebuchadnezzar in the first exile group before the final fall of Jerusalem. He was lonely for God, and he was homesick. Did not the God of Abraham reside in Jerusalem, and did not the God of Moses dwell in the Ark of the Covenant in the temple? The whole concept of, where was God? Was God in Babylon? Well, no. God lived in the temple, which was in Jerusalem. And if you destroyed the temple, where was God? Did he disappear? Was he dead? Wow. Because to me, the concept of God is dead seems to spark something in my mind of like the 1960s. Wasn't that a popular phrase in the 1960s? God is dead. So he's dealing with where's God when I'm scared, if you want to make it into a Veggie Tales. Ezekiel wanted to know, where was God during the exile? Is there grace in the midst of our storm? Is God still there even when we can't feel him? We all want to experience God sometimes. We all want to reach up and touch him, and we all, especially during worship services, we all want to have that mountaintop feeling of, oh, I've been with the Lord. Well, what happens when you don't feel like you've been with the Lord? Is he still there? Yeah. God does not come and go based on our feelings, no more than he comes and goes based on a temple. And so Ezekiel is sitting by the river, and he has this vision. It's the wheel in the sky, and suddenly the heavens were open, and Ezekiel saw 4 creatures, each with 4 faces, turned toward 4 corners of the earth. The faces were like an ox and a lion and an eagle and a man, the symbols of God. Powerful like an ox, courageous like a lion, soaring like an eagle, touching the hearts of people. These creatures were cherubim, guardians of the God's throne. Seeing them, Ezekiel knew that God is everywhere, even to the 4 corners of the earth. He's not just in the Jerusalem temple. And this was something that was very powerful for the future of Israel to recognize. Think about the diaspora. Think about where are Jews today. Think about the coming, as Ezekiel is writing, we are getting ready to go into the pre-rabbinical period, where we have Jews that live all over the world. We have one of the largest Jewish populations during Jesus' time was in Egypt, and as Paul in his travels shows, every time he goes to a new place, he finds a synagogue, except for the one that the group of women that Lydia led, because there weren't enough men to form a synagogue. But think of that. The idea, doesn't this set the stage so well for the New Testament and for the future of Israel? The idea that God is everywhere. God is not just in Jerusalem. God is not just in the temple or in the tabernacle. That he is all throughout. He is the concept of omnipotence. That he is everywhere at the same time. And so this becomes very important in the future of Israel, because they finally learn that God is with them no matter where they go. And that's important for them to carry with them throughout the dispersion. And it was equally important for Ezekiel to realize when he was in captivity in Babylon. So he goes on to say, he says, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth besides the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. When they moved in any of the 4 directions. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. And this is from chapter 1, 15 through 19. I understand, cried Ezekiel. Those chariot wheels turning, rolling away from Jerusalem, were not rolling away from God. God was in the wheels. God moved with the people of Israel. God moved with the movement. The God of the universe was everywhere. Now the people of Israel could sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land, in any land. All right. That is what I think the major and minor prophets had envisioned for Yahweh's people. Restoration and the understanding that God is omnipotent and omniscient. Omniscient. That's the second one. Thank you. Bye-bye.